So I'm hoping that by the time we finish this, everybody will kind of have an understanding of the differences between mandatory, voluntary, uncommitted, and committed cost share. And we'll talk a little bit about parts of a cost share package that you might want to build. These are the different topics that we're going to go through. I'm not going to bother going through this slide. So what is cost share? So basically you can go back to the Code of Federal Regulations, Title II, which is the federal source for all of the information related to managing grants and contracts. And so their definition is that cost share or match is a portion of project costs that aren't paid by federal funds. Now, if you're working with a non-federal sponsor, they're pretty much going to use this same definition, except where federal is, they're going to substitute the type of organization that they are. So like if it's a nonprofit or foundation. Sponsors ask for cost share for a variety of reasons. One of the biggest is that it makes the dollars that they have go further so that they can get more work done that meets whatever the mission is that they're trying to meet. Some of them like to have it because they see it as the organization is involved in not only doing the work, but they also have benefit to the outcome because they're putting their own funds against whatever the work is that's being done. A big reason with some of the federal sponsors is that it improves how much they can say that they got accomplished to whoever they're reporting to. So for example, if you've got a Department of Energy proposal and they ask for a 20% cost share, which you gave to them, and then you eventually provided more cost share, they can go back to Congress and they can say, oh, well, we had this $10 million proposal, but we leveraged it into a $20 million project. So however much that they can get cost share provided on, that is what they can report that they leverage that project into being. So sometimes that's why they'll ask for more cost share than what was actually a requirement in the guidelines. So what are the different types of cost share? And these are very important to know. So the first one that you have is involuntary, and it's also called mandatory. So this is when it's actually in the guidelines and it says how much you have to provide, and it's a condition of award. If you don't provide it, then you won't be considered for award for that particular proposal. And sometimes you'll also hear this called hard match. Voluntary committed is where the institution or the PIs involved in doing that proposal are committing or volunteering to bear a portion of the cost. So it's not required in the guidelines, or you're doing something above what's required in the guidelines, and you're just providing it of your own free will. Sometimes people do that in hopes that they'll get higher ratings. The third type is called voluntary uncommitted. And that's where you're committing to expenses, but you're not putting a hard figure against them. So it's unquantified or unspecified. So an example of this would be if you make a statement in the proposal, the PI will commit additional time as necessary to complete the objectives of the proposal at no cost to the sponsor. So that would be voluntary uncommitted time. You haven't specified how much time you're committing, but you are saying that you're going to commit something. If you change that statement and you said the PI is going to commit 10% of their time over the academic year in support of this proposal, then now you have switched from uncommitted, because you quantified it, to voluntary committed. So now the sponsor can ask that it be tracked and reported to them because you put hard numbers against it. Then we have what I call gray cost share. So this is when the guidelines may say that no cost share is required in one place. Then in another place, they may say that it's recommended. Or if you look through the whole guidelines, when you get to the part where it talks about points for review or criteria for award, and they give points if you have cost share provided. Well, that's kind of a gray area, because in one hand, they've said you don't have to have cost share. And in another place, they've said, Oh, but you do have to if you really want to be considered for award. And in many cases, we consider this a type of mandatory cost share. You'll also have some solicitations require institutional commitment. For example, after the course of your project is over, they may want you to explain how you're going to continue with this project using institutional commitment after the project ends. You may also have commitments that you're making to show that the institution is supporting the work that's being done that are institutional commitments. Sometimes, yes.
Can you tell us, is there any evidence that suggests that offering voluntary cost share does increase the chance of securing funding?
From the things that I've seen, there's no hard evidence that proves that if you provide cost share, the first decision on whether or not your proposal is probably going to be picked for funding is going to be based on the quality of the work that you're doing, or like the project description, the information that's in the narrative, what it is you're actually doing. The only time that if you're providing cost share versus someone who's not may come into consideration is if they're trying to break a tie between picking two different proposals.
Is there any evidence that offering more cost share than what is required gives you a better chance?
No. Unless the sponsor is pushing you to provide additional cost share, it's actually a negative for the university, because the more cost share you provide, the worse it is in many respects for the institution, because it affects our indirect cost agreement. And we'll get into that a little bit more later on. One of the other things I wanted to mention on institutional commitment is many times institutional commitment is something that you can reference without using hard numbers. And so then that makes it so that it's not something that has to be tracked later on. If you have proposals that involve national labs, something that you need to be aware of is that a national lab cannot legally provide cost share for the funds that they're involved with in a proposal. So let's say that you've got a national lab involved and they've got to provide 20% cost share on their funds. That means they can't provide it, so you have to provide it. Whoever the person is who's submitting that proposal has to make sure that their cost share package includes the funds that are going to cover the match that's needed for the national labs that are involved. Now, you can do that either through other third-party cost share or through providing more on your own, or if you've got other subcontracts who can provide cost share, you can help share the burden with them. But you do have to cover it if the national lab is going to be involved. We also get a lot of questions about what's the difference between in-kind match and cash match. So in-kind match is the value of something that's going to be applied to the cost. So like you're a PI, you're working on the proposal, you're not going to receive funds for all the time that you're working on this proposal. So the percentage of time that you're going to document that you are going to be working on this proposal could be an in-kind type of cost share, because normally you would be paid for that work, but you're volunteering to do it for free. Cash match is expenditures that you're going to make specifically for that proposal. And usually those can't be done prior to the proposal work starting. So an example would be, there's a piece of equipment that you need to do this work and you don't actually have it on hand right now. So you can say that you're going to cash match because you're going to go out and purchase that equipment to use with this proposal. The thing that you have to watch with that is that you usually cannot buy that piece of equipment until the award starts, because if you purchase it before the award starts, then it's no longer an expenditure that you're making for that particular proposal because you've purchased it before the proposal started. A lot of times sponsors and organizations, just about everybody in fact, uses the terms in-kind and cash match pretty much interchangeably. So you have to read the guidelines very closely to see if they've differentiated between what you can provide for in-kind and what you can provide for cash match. You also have to be aware of the basic federal cost principles when it comes to building your budget and how that affects cost share. So if you haven't had any training on this, you might want to take the budget part 1 class that we have, because it talks about allocability, allowability, consistency, and reasonableness applied to cost share. So basically what they're saying is, if you're doing a proposal and you're promising cost share, it's got to be something particular to that proposal that you're doing. It's got to be allowed by the sponsor. It's got to be something used on that proposal. I can't say that I'm going to provide $10,000 worth of cost match on proposal A if the work for proposal A is that I'm promising is actually not being done for proposal A, it's being done for proposal B. Because what I'm promising for proposal A has to be expended and allowed for proposal A. I can't just randomly say whatever I'm doing for cost share someplace else is going to be able to be applied to the particular proposal that has the cost share requirement. As part of this, usually if an item isn't allowed by the sponsor as a direct cost, then you also can't use it as match. So for example, if the sponsor doesn't allow PI salary, then you can't use PI salary as a match unless we find out from the sponsor that yes, you can. And sometimes they'll say that in the guidelines. How you value the cost share has to be fair and reasonable, and you have to be able to demonstrate it. So for example, it's very common if you promise that you're going to cost share a graduate student, for example. At award, the sponsor may come to us and they ask, show us an HR document where this student has this salary, or how you came up with the estimate of what the salary for the student was going to be. We may have to provide a printout of what the PI salary is from HR if that was used as part of a cost share package. Something to prove that the valuation that was given was fair. Unrecovered indirect cost can sometimes be counted against a sponsor's cost share. A lot of times the sponsor will say, we're going to restrict your IDC to say 30%. And so our rate would normally be 55%. And so normally we could take that gap that between 30% and 55%, and we could count that amount as unrecovered as cost share. However, the sponsor has to say that we can. If we're providing direct cost as part of our match package, let's say we're going to promise to spend $3,000 in travel, then normally if we had asked the sponsor to pay that, they would have paid us unrecovered IDC. So we can say, well, we're paying for this $3,000. We have IDC on it too. So that's unrecovered IDC on the match. And most sponsors will allow us to count that as part of our match package. When you're doing your package, another thing to keep in mind is that when it comes to award, you can't have double pledged something as match. So at proposal submission, if you've got 3 proposals going in and they all require match, and you use, let's say you've got a third-party cost share from another company, company ABC, and you use the cost share from this company ABC against all 3 of those proposals, and you get real lucky and all 3 of those proposals get awarded, now you have a cost share issue you've got to resolve, because you can only use that one pledge against one award. So ABC can only go against one proposal. You've got to find replacement cost share sources for your second and third proposal that got funded, because the government won't let you count one source of cost share against 3 different applications once it's in an award stage. When you're matching for federal funds, the source of your funds has to be from non-federal sources. So the federal government doesn't want you using other federal government funds to provide your cost share. They want you to be using institutional funds, state funds, nonprofit, and for-profit funds. They want your cost share package to consist of other funds beyond the federal government that is showing a commitment to getting this work done. Do we have any more questions? Nope, okay. So when a sponsor requires that you provide cost share, usually they'll give you some information in the solicitation about what that package needs to include. Sometimes they'll tell you what's allowed or not allowed. They'll give you a minimum percentage or amount that you have to meet or a ratio. They'll tell you how they want it reported in the submission sometimes. They'll tell you how they want it calculated. And usually that is by either a set amount or a ratio or percentage. And one of the things that you need to pay close attention to is if they say whether they want it calculated on the sponsor requested amount or on the total cost. Because if they want to count it on the total cost, then they want the percentage calculated in an amount that also includes consideration for the cost share that's being provided. So that can have a big difference in your package. If the specific solicitation that you're looking at doesn't have information on what they allow or don't allow in the cost share or how they want it calculated, sometimes the sponsors have general guidelines that need to be checked for that information. And if you're a PI that's looking at this, know that in ORS, your proposal development specialist will help you come up with the right calculations for what the cost share package needs to have in it as far as the amount that has to be provided to the sponsor. How does a sponsor capture cost share? And this is not only from the perspective of what you might be reporting on your budget form or your budget justification. They can look through information that's provided in letters on your 424 cover form and any other component that they want to. So your abstract, your description, facilities, effort tables, any place that you mention that you're going to provide something, especially if you quantify it in an award package, they can ask that it be incorporated as part of the award, and then you have to report on it. I listed current and pending separately because many federal sponsors have come out recently saying that they won't use current and pending for the purpose of capturing cost share. So you're usually safe mentioning true amounts of effort that you're providing on the various proposals that you're involved in. But know that there are times that they do look at current and pending or effort tables, and they do capture cost share that way. If they are going to require you to provide cost share as part of your award, then that should be mentioned in the award documents. And so that's where the award documents have to be looked at closely to see what needs to be reported on as far as the cost share is related to the award. How do you build a cost share package? So some things that you can look at are the personnel that are involved in the project, not only their salary, but also their fringe benefits. You have to know how you're coming to that. You can't just dream up a salary and say, oh, I'm going to hire a person and we're going to pay them $300,000. And so I'm going to provide all of this cost share. That $300,000 is going to be part of my cost share package. Well, that's fine if you want to submit like that, but when it comes time for the award, or if prior to the award the sponsor's looking at that, the sponsor is going to go back and they're going to look at what that person is doing, and they're going to say, well, does that level of pay sound reasonable for a person who's being hired to do that work? And if it doesn't, then they're going to come back to you and they're going to question, how did you come up with that figure? If you're using equipment as part of your cost share, it doesn't have to necessarily be equipment that you're going to go out and buy for a particular proposal. It could be equipment that you already have on hand that you're going to be using for this proposal that you're not charging for. So you're going to be using a percentage of this equipment's value for this proposal, and you're going to count it as part of your cost share package. I would caution you, though, that equipment has a formula that has to be used with it, because you have to take into consideration the depreciated value of the equipment. So if the equipment's more than 10 years old, chances are it doesn't have value left in it that can be used for match. You also have to look at usage limits. So if you say, I'm going to use this piece of equipment for 100% of its time for this proposal, and an auditor comes in and finds out that you used it on 2 other proposals, then you've got a problem. So you need to look at how you're going to use this piece of equipment in the calculations for your cost share. Other things you can use as part of your package might be travel or supplies. If you're going to help provide some publication cost. If tuition is not allowed as part of the sponsor's guidelines, but they do require cost share, the graduate college will allow tuition remission to be shown as cost share for that proposal. Unrecovered indirect cost, both between what the sponsor might allow and what cost you have on match that you're providing, may be allowed to be part of your package. The department or the college or the provost may provide funds. You can go to the vice president for research and partnerships and ask for match. You can use PI startup funds. If you have incentive funds that you've been holding in an account waiting to use, those can be used. I would note that if you're going to ask for a VPRP cost share match, they usually like to see a budget in relationship to the work that you're doing. And they also like to see what kind of participation in the match package is being provided by the PI, the department, and the college. You can have third-party match in most cost share packages. And this would be where you get a letter from a subcontract or from maybe a company or a state agency or school that's participating in this proposal with you, that maybe has some in-kind costs that they're willing to document as cost share, or maybe they want to help provide some cash match. Maybe they're going to help purchase some supplies for you. This would all be things that could document as third-party match. If you have the type of proposal where you might be charging for a workshop that's related to the research or the sponsored effort that you're doing, you might have program income. Program income can count as part of your cost share package too. You can also have volunteer time, but this time has to be logged and it has to be appropriate for the level of work that's being done, and I'll explain that in a second. We normally don't have volunteer time that's logged on an OU proposal as a direct part of a cost share package, but it is common that we will see those if we have a cost share package where there's a third-party commitment from a nonprofit, because it's very common in nonprofits to use volunteer time as part of their match. So what I mean by logged and appropriate. So let's say you're doing a proposal that involves landscaping around schools, and the schools have volunteered to help with this. Then the school could give you a third-party letter where they're going to have 100 hours of support based on whatever the current salary is for minimum wage. And they're going to keep a chart that logs when people start and when people stop working on a particular day. Now, let's say one of the parents that's going to volunteer to work on this project is a doctor. And normally they make $300 an hour. When they come in to work on this project, their time is not valued at $300 an hour. Their time is valued like everybody else's at minimum wage. And so that's what I mean by appropriate for the level of work. If the person, let's say, is going to be supervising a team that's out there working, then it's okay to pay them, quote, on their volunteer time, a little bit higher salary because they're supervising. So you've got to take that all into consideration when you're looking at volunteer time.
Fran,
Yes.
can you use remaining funds in residual status from a previous fixed price contract as match, or does it maintain its federal fund status?
If your federal award is completely closed out and you need to work with Research Financial Services on this to make sure everything is completed and done, the residual funds that are left then become the property of the university. So those can be used for match someplace else. You can spend them however you want. If you're going to travel out of them, or if you're going to use it to buy something for your lab. But you've got to work with Research Financial Services to make sure everything is completely closed out on that fixed price contract before you do anything else with those funds. How do you document cost share? A lot of the documentation that we do within OU on cost share is based on internal systems. So by that, I mean, you may get your approvals from like your department chair or the VPRP. We will document that in Cayuse. And when the internal routing goes through the Cayuse system and you sign off as a PI and your department chair and your dean sign off, all those people that are signing off, everybody is signing off saying that they have read the stuff that's routing and are acknowledging that if there are commitments for cost share that are loaded, they're certifying that they agree to provide those commitments. You may also have letters that are provided, like if you need a letter from the institution or the VPRP that documents the cost share amount, then ORS will help you obtain those letters. If you have third-party cost share, you're usually going to have to provide that in a letter, and the third party is the one who has to assign the value for that cost share, and we will ask you for that as part of your routing package. If you're providing cash match, then at award or during your expenditure phase with Research Financial Services, you're going to have to provide records of that back to the sponsor. For example, an invoice where you purchased something to prove that you provided that cost to the proposal. And I mentioned before, those purchases usually can't be before the award start date. If you make those purchases before the award start date, then we need to go back to the sponsor and make sure that that will be still acceptable as cost share or not, because many of them won't allow it if you do it before the start date of the award. And any questions that you've got on like documentation that's needed post-award to report to the sponsor, be sure and talk to your person that helps you in Research Financial Services to make sure that you capture all of your cost share the way that it needs to be captured for the particular sponsor that you're working with.
Fran?
Yes.
For volunteer hours, can you use the current estimated value from independentsector.org? Do you know that?
Yes. That's an acceptable source as long as you know that that's where you got it from. So if an auditor or somebody asks, you can point back to it and say that this is where it came from. How do we manage cost share commitments at OU? So OU prefers that you don't provide cost sharing proposals unless it's required. It says in the solicitation that you've got to provide X amount of cost share, either a percentage or an amount. And the reason why is because the more cost share you provide, then when it comes time for us to do our rate negotiation, which is done by someone in the federal government, they look at the amount of cost share that's been provided and they say, well, if you as a university can afford to provide $10 million more in cost share than what's been required, then obviously you can afford more of the cost of doing the research at your institution. And so it makes our IDC rate go down, which means we recover less of the actual cost that it takes us to do the research. If you need cost share and the PI in the department can't meet whatever the level is, and you can't find a third-party person that's going to help provide some, that's when you come to the VPRP and you do a cost share request form. And I mentioned before that you usually have to provide a budget, and they usually want to see where the PI or the department are participating in part of that match, if possible. If not, go ahead and ask, because if you don't ever ask, you won't ever get. Keep in mind, you need to allow time for consideration. So don't wait until 2 days before the deadline and then put in a cost share request into the VPRP.
Okay.
Also
okay,
be
so,
aware that the match that you get,
the way I have it
Fran,
sitting, so
Fran, could you hold for just a minute? Could
so
could
this
everyone
one
make sure
is
that
75,
mics are
and
muted?
it is a
Never mind. I got it.
another thing to keep in mind if you're requesting cost share from the VPRP, if the proposal you're working on allows indirect cost, then the VPRP may say, okay, yes, I'm going to provide this $25,000 in match, but it's going to be pulled from IDC recovery. And so that may affect the IDC incentive that's available for calculation later on in the future. Be aware that if there are documents that are required for mandatory cost share, they may have certain levels of signatures that are required on them. Most of the time, they're going to require either an authorized organizational official, which is usually not the PI or the department or chair. Sometimes they'll say that they want something signed by the president. Most of the time, that has been delegated to people within the VPRP offices. So don't automatically go to the president and say that you need something signed. Work through your PDS. We'll help you, let you know if you need to get a presidential signature or not, or if someone's already had that delegated to them. Research Financial Services does track any cost share that's quantified that's tied to an award, especially if it has to be reported to a sponsor. Any type of cost share that you provide that's quantified is subject to having to be proved to the sponsor and is auditable. So if you voluntarily said you were going to provide 5% of your time, even though it might not be picked up in the award documents, if an auditor either from that federal agency or from some other place came and looked at the paperwork associated with your award, they would expect to see that 5% of time tracked and recorded for that proposal, because you promised you were going to provide it, and you've got to show that you are, even if the award documents aren't picking it up. OU may track cost share internally that's not reported to a sponsor. That's why we want you to do the OU internal spreadsheets. An example of this would be in maybe talking with your PDS, you mentioned that you're going to provide 10% of your time as cost share. And the sponsor doesn't require cost share, but because you're quantifying it internally with as part of your budget justification or wherever, we put it in the budget. That's so that everyone within your department realizes that you've got these time commitments. If your contract says you're only allowed to do 30% of your time as research, and you're hitting 50% of your time, then you and your department chair may need to go back and look at your time commitments, and possibly maybe you need to arrange for some course release or something to make sure that you can meet the research commitments that you're making. OU expects all the organizations that are involved in your proposal team to bear their burden of the cost share, unless they're a national lab. So if you've got HSC or OSU as subcontracts on a proposal that you're submitting, and the guidelines require 20% cost share, then we are going to expect OSU and HSC to provide 20% cost share on the amount of funds that they're getting as part of their work on this proposal. If you've got a person who feels like they can't meet that match, then as a PI, you can request permission to meet that match for them. And better yet, if possible, you can make third-party arrangements to cover the cost share. So if you've got a company or a nonprofit who's willing to provide match, that match can be applied however you want within the package that you're providing it. So it could cover like your national lab that's going to be participating with you. How does post-award reporting affect your budget? So I mentioned before, you need to work with Research Financial Services on what documentation they have to provide as part of your reporting. Say, for example, you had a third party that gave us a letter at proposal submission that they were going to provide $50,000 of in-kind time. So at award stage, refs is going to expect something from that company where they show that they expended that amount of effort and time on this proposal and how it was valued. Don't wait until you get to proposal closeout or the end of a reporting period to be asking about how cost share needs to be reported, because it may be something that needs to be reported at various times in accordance with your spending or report requirements to the sponsor. And so I went through this a little bit on some of the different things that I've seen. So sometimes a sponsor will ask that cost share only has to be reported right at the very end of the award, just prior to closeout. And they don't care how you met it all along. They're just interested, does the final number meet the number that it needs to be? Sometimes they'll have it based on a monthly, a quarterly, or a yearly target that you need to meet. Sometimes it'll be based on a spending threshold. So for example, for every $25,000 that you spend, you've also got to show $25,000 in cost match. We also have some sponsors that require the cost share to be shown as being spent first before they'll provide any funds as part of your package of expenditures. A good example of this would be OCAST. OCAST requires you to show that you've spent $10,000 in funds in cost share before they'll give you $10,000 of their money to spend for however your budget showed it was going to be spent. So it's very important for a PI to be aware of how the cost share is going to be reported during the life of the award phase of their proposal, because that's going to affect the documentation and the timing for when they have to provide information. What are some common issues? The biggest one that we have is unintended commitments, or a PI making a commitment and them not understanding that it is cost share. So if a PI, let's say you're involved in a proposal with HSC, and the PI from HSC says, hey, is it okay if I list you on this proposal for 2% of your time? And you're like, oh yeah, sure, just put me down for 2%, that's fine. They put you down for 2%. When the award comes in, the award from NIH says, Dr. So-and-so has 2% time commitment. Well, at the point that the PI at HSC put that down as 2% in their package they were submitting, that became official committed cost share, which should have routed through ORS for approval for that to have been provided. And definitely now that it's come back in the award package, now it's got to be tracked and reported on from OU to whoever submitted that package. As a submitting organization, whoever's the one who's submitting the package to the federal sponsor is the one who is holding the bag on all the cost share. So let's say you have 10 people involved in a proposal, or 10 organizations involved in this proposal with you, and 2 of them back out, and you're going to shift their funds however you're going to shift them. Whatever they were providing as match, you as the PI at the submitting organization are responsible for covering that match. So you've got to figure out how it's going to be covered. Are you going to provide more additional in-kind time? Are you going to go back to your other subcontracts and ask if they can cover a portion of the cost share that is now left out in space? It's got to be covered. Are you going to try and find a third party person who can provide some match that'll help cover the gap that you've now got? So it's very important to be aware of the fact that when you're submitting a package to a sponsor, regardless of whether it's federal or not, and you say that you're going to provide a certain amount of cost share, that is what the organization who's giving us the money is going to expect you to be able to provide. We also have issues sometimes with documentation for third-party cost share, that the letters or the subcontract documents come in are not signed by the correct person who can commit for the organization. Maybe it's signed by a PI or someone who just doesn't have that appointed legal authority to actually make the promise for that cost share. Be aware too that there are some sponsors that may reduce or waive a cost share requirement if they're asked, but if negotiations or that request is going to be made, ORS needs to be involved in those conversations. I had special notes for OCAST and Oklahoma Department of Transportation. OCAST programs, some of them don't require match, some of them do. The ones that do usually don't allow state funds for matching. So that means OU salaries for in-kind match can't be used. Any funds that you're providing have to be coming from a non-state source for that match. ODOT also sometimes allows strange components like past awards that you got from ODOT. Sometimes they will let those be used as part of a current cost share package. And both OCAST and ODOT will allow sometimes future awards. So you can say, I'm projecting I'm going to put in for a $50,000 award, and you can use that as part of your match at the proposal stage. At award stage, you've got to be able to come up with the match to meet that package. So if you haven't put in for that proposal and you haven't received an award yet, and you need it when that award starts, then you've got to come up with replacement cost share that's acceptable to the sponsor. Another issue that we have is having enough time to work through cost share issues, like to get the actual documentation that we need from a third party or from the VPRP. In award, at award, timely reporting of the cost share, especially from third party sources, can be an issue. If there are discrepancies between what was submitted in the proposal documents and what came in the award documents, then those are things that need to be looked at as the award documents are being received, so that they can be called into question and maybe they can be taken out of the package, especially if it was cost share that really wasn't intended. A good example of this that I have is, at one point we had a PI that made $1 million cost share commitment simply because of a statement that they made in the package that such and such and such and such was valued or worth $1 million. And the way it was worded, legitimately, the sponsor took it as a cost share. And it counted in their decision on this particular proposal, making it to a second round of consideration. But in talking with the PI, we found out that it really wasn't an actual cost share commitment. It was just something that they were making where they were trying to explain the value of something they were using, not something they were providing as match. And so we had to go back to the sponsor and explain this, that it wasn't matched, to get it taken out. If you suspect that you've got a cost share issue, like for example, you're having problems getting documentation from like a department within OU to back up some expenditures that you've got for cost share, or from your subcontract or your third party, don't just wait in silence for the issue to go away. If it's part of the package that you're building for a submission, let ORS know that you're having problems. If it's part of an award package, let your refs contact know that there's an issue. Don't wait for it to go away until award closeout, or it has to be firmly reported and then you start running behind, or hope that it's something nobody's going to be noticed, because Murphy's Law just about guarantees that the auditor is going to find that. Are there any other questions?